forced to marry the Duke, scorned by his mistress, until the twins changed everything. The halls of Count Veyron's estate echoed with whispers long before the official announcement. Servants carried trays with trembling hands, pausing only to steal glances at the young lady whose destiny had just been sealed. Celene, daughter of the Count, had always been admired. Her beauty was a topic of endless conversation in the salons of the nobility, her intelligence praised by tutors who claimed she absorbed knowledge like the richest soil absorbed rain. Yet, for all her qualities, her life was not her own to direct. The Duke of Ravenshade had requested her hand, and in the world she inhabited, a request from a duke was not an invitation. It was a command veiled in courtesy. Her father, blinded by ambition and hungry for connections that could lift his name among the greatest houses, did not hesitate. The ink on the contract of marriage was still drying when he clasped the Duke's hand in triumph, already imagining the doors that would open to him. Celene stood by the window that night, her face pale under the moonlight. She had heard of the Duke, Theron Ravenshade, a man spoken of with awe and unease. A soldier in his youth, hardened by battles, now feared as much for his power as admired for his fortune. Yet, what struck Celene most were not the stories of his victories or his estate stretching farther than the horizon. It was the rumor that lingered like smoke around him. He was not a man who believed in love. When the announcement was made, nobles praised her fortune, envied her rise, and declared that beauty had found its perfect place at the Duke's side. Celene, however, felt a knot tightening in her chest. She knew too well what such a union meant. It was not her heart he desired, nor her laughter, nor the gentleness of her spirit. It was her lineage, her father's eagerness, and the heirs she could provide. She was to be a jewel in his crown, polished and displayed yet never truly held. Her mother tried to comfort her, whispering that all noble marriages were alliances first and affections later. But Celene's heart rebelled in silence. She wanted more than duty, more than a name spoken in court. She wanted to be seen, not as a pawn, not as a means to power, but as a woman. Still, when the wedding day arrived a mere month later, she stood before the altar dressed in silks of ivory and gold, her hair crowned with pearls, her lips uttering vows that tasted like ashes. Theron's eyes did not soften as he lifted her veil. He was handsome in the way marble statues are handsome, imposing, flawless, and cold. His voice was steady as he pronounced her his wife, but there was no warmth behind the words. The guests applauded, the choirs sang, and the bells of the city rang in celebration. Yet within her, Celene felt the bells tolling for something else entirely. The burial of her freedom, the sealing of her fate. She entered the Duke's carriage that evening, not as a bride beginning a new life, but as a prisoner stepping into a gilded cell. The journey to Ravenshade would be long, and the path before her even longer. And though she could not yet see the trials awaiting her, she felt them in her bones, like the chill of a storm gathering beyond the horizon. The carriage wheels rumbled against the cobblestones as the sun sank behind the hills, throwing the ducal lands into shadows of crimson and gold. Celene sat with her hands folded in her lap, her wedding dress now covered by a cloak lined with sable, yet her fingers trembled beneath the fabric. The silence of her husband was more oppressive than the ride itself. He had scarcely spoken since they left her father's estate, his gaze fixed beyond the window as if the very world outside interested him more than the woman seated beside him. When the gates of Ravenshade rose into view, her breath caught. The ducal palace was less a home than a fortress, with towers that clawed at the sky and walls so high they seemed built to keep joy itself from entering. The soldiers saluted as the carriage passed, their faces stern, their armor glinting in the fading light. Celene felt the weight of the land she had just inherited pressing against her chest. This was not a house she could soften with laughter or gentle touches. It was a domain ruled by steel. The great doors opened, and she stepped onto the polished stones of the grand hall. Chandeliers burned with hundreds of candles, their light dancing across marble columns and tapestries depicting battles, victories, and blood. But it was not the opulence that drew her eye. It was the woman standing at the top of the staircase, her figure draped in velvet the color of midnight, her beauty striking, her smile triumphant. Lyria, the Duke's mistress. Celene did not need an introduction. The familiarity in Theron's eyes as he looked upon the woman was sharper than any words he could have spoken. He walked past his new bride, ascending the steps not with eagerness, but with a certain relief, as though he were returning to what truly mattered. Lyria extended her hand to him, and he kissed it lightly, his expression softening for the first time that evening. The courtiers who had gathered lowered their gazes, but their whispers filled the hall like a swarm of bees. Celene stood motionless, the humiliation sinking into her skin. A duchess for a single night, already overshadowed by the mistress who dared not even conceal her place in his life. Theron finally turned to Celene, his voice calm, almost detached. "You will find your chambers prepared. Lyria resides here as well. Respect her presence, and she will respect yours. Do not interfere, and we shall live in peace." Respect. Peace. The words rang like chains being locked. Celene bowed her head, her mind swirling. She had been raised among the nobility, trained to smile through slights, to bend without breaking, to endure the weight of ambition disguised as duty. But as she lifted her gaze once more to Lyria's victorious smirk, she knew that this was not a passing discomfort. It was a war of silent weapons, and she had been thrown onto a battlefield without armor. Her heart pounded as the servants led her to her new chambers, each step echoing with the truth she could not escape. She was not the only woman in the Duke's house, nor was she the one he cherished. She was the one he required. And in the shadows of Ravenshade, that truth would shape every breath she took. The days after her arrival stretched like a trial of endurance. Celene walked the corridors of Ravenshade Palace with a queen's posture but a prisoner's heart. Servants bowed, courtiers offered polite words, yet all eyes seemed to measure her against the woman who openly occupied the Duke's affection. Lyria moved freely through the palace, her laughter echoing down the marble halls, her gowns brighter than the Duchess's own, and Theron did nothing to disguise it. On the seventh night, as the bells of the chapel tolled in the distance, the silence of Celene's chamber was broken by a firm knock. She had been waiting for it, dreading it. Her maid looked at her with pity, then lowered her eyes and withdrew, leaving her alone as the door opened. The Duke entered. He came not as a lover, not even as a husband, but as a man fulfilling a duty. His face betrayed reluctance, his steps heavy, his words stripped of warmth. "We will honor the arrangement," he said flatly. "Once a week, as expected. Though I see no reason it should be more than that. Lyria finds it unpleasant." The words struck like cold steel. Lyria's name, even here, even now. Celene clenched her hands at her sides, hiding the tremor in her fingers. She wanted to scream, to remind him that she was not a vessel for heirs, not a shadow to be tolerated, but the Duchess he had chosen, the woman who bore his name. Yet her voice froze in her throat. He approached, and though his indifference wounded her, his beauty was undeniable. His frame was tall, his shoulders broad, his features carved with the elegance of noble blood. To many, he was the ideal husband. But to Celene, in that moment, he was nothing more than a stranger wearing a crown of duty. The union was swift. For him, it seemed no more than the fulfillment of obligation. For her, it was the shattering of a dream she had barely allowed herself to hold. She had guarded her virtue, imagining one day it would be given to a man who cherished her. Instead, it was taken by one who could scarcely look into her eyes. When it was over, he rose without a word, adjusting his cloak as though eager to escape. Celene lay in silence, the weight of indifference pressing heavier than any touch. As he left, the door closing behind him, she whispered into the empty chamber, "I am your wife, yet you treat me as nothing." Her chest ached as the truth settled deeper. This was not a union of hearts, but a contract of flesh and name. And if this was to be her life, she could not endure it as a silent figure in the background of her husband's passions. That night, as the candles burned low, a plan began to form within her. If love would not grant her freedom, then strategy would. She would turn her suffering into a weapon. She would cloak herself in innocence, in victimhood, and let the whispers of society judge the man who scorned her. If Theron and his mistress wished to humiliate her, then she would make their shame echo in every noble hall until it became unbearable. But fate, cruel and unpredictable, had already written another twist in her story, one that would make every plan she built tremble. Celene awoke the next morning with a heaviness that was not only in her body, but in her spirit. The sheets still carried the scent of a night she would rather forget. She looked around the chamber, its walls adorned with golden embroidery, its windows opening to vast gardens, and felt no comfort. A palace built to inspire awe was nothing more than a prison when the heart inside it ached for something it would never have. She knew now that endurance alone would destroy her. To suffer in silence while Lyria paraded through the halls as though she were the true lady of the house was to wither day by day. Celene had seen enough of courtly life to understand its greatest truth. Reputations were worth more than gold. A man could own armies, lands, and titles, but if his name was smeared by whispers, he was ruined. So she formed her plan. She would not confront the Duke with anger. Anger only fed his disdain. Instead, she would become the picture of quiet suffering, the Duchess wronged and patient, the noblewoman whose dignity shone even as her heart was bruised. In salons, she would let her silences speak louder than words. Among ladies of rank, she would allow her gaze to lower just enough to stir curiosity. And when the questions came, because questions always came, she would not accuse her husband. She would only let them draw their own conclusions. The story would spread like fire through dry fields. The tale of the abandoned Duchess, humiliated by a husband enslaved to his mistress. Nobles adored tragedy when it was not their own. They would pity her, defend her, champion her. And in time, when her sorrow had become their outrage, she could demand freedom, perhaps even annulment, with society itself as her shield. But Celene was not naive. She knew that to make such a plan succeed, she needed more than whispers. She needed evidence. She began keeping records of the mistress's extravagances, the jewels and gowns ordered at the expense of the Duke's treasury, the feasts thrown in her honor, the indiscretions witnessed by servants. She tucked them away, piece by piece, weaving the net she would one day cast. Yet beneath her calculated resolve, a fear lingered. What if this game consumed her before it freed her? Could she truly outplay a man who held the power of life and death over her? Could she truly endure the scorn of a mistress who watched her every move with venom in her eyes? Late at night, she would press her hand against her chest and whisper to herself, "I will not break." And for a time, she believed it. What she could not foresee was that destiny had already begun to move its hand. For even as she prepared to turn society against her husband, her own body was preparing a revelation that would unravel everything she thought she controlled. Weeks passed beneath the cold stone arches of Ravenshade, and Celene carried her secret plan like a blade hidden beneath her gown. She wore her sorrow with grace, allowing her silence to sting sharper than any accusation. She played her role as Duchess with poise, attending councils, receiving visitors, even managing the vast household with diligence. The servants grew to admire her, the courtiers began to pity her, and slowly, the whispers she had imagined began to breathe through the halls of the nobility. Her plan was working, but fate, ever cruel, struck when she least expected it. One morning, as pale light filtered through the high windows, Celene collapsed upon the floor of her chamber. The world spun, her body trembled, and her maid rushed to fetch the physician. The old man, whose hands had delivered noble heirs for decades, pressed his ear against her chest, studied her eyes, and finally spoke words that fell like thunder. "You are with child, my lady. Not one, but two. Twins." The chamber seemed to close in around her. Celene's lips parted, but no sound escaped. Twins. In a single night of duty, from the only embrace she had shared with Theron, her body now carried the heirs he desired most. Her plan of whispered tragedy shattered in an instant. No longer could she hope for annulment. No longer could she dream of a quiet escape. She was bound more tightly than ever, not by contract or duty, but by two lives growing within her. The news spread swiftly, as news always did. By evening, every noble in the capital spoke of the Duchess's miracle. The barren mistress who had never given the Duke a child was overshadowed by the new wife, who carried not one heir but two. The palace was alive with congratulations, yet beneath the words, Celene saw the sparks of envy, suspicion, and malice. Lyria's smile at the supper table was sharper than any dagger. Her hands trembled as she lifted her goblet, her gaze darting between Celene's serene composure and Theron's sudden air of pride. For the first time since their wedding, the Duke looked upon his wife with something more than indifference. The prospect of heirs, of legacy, lit a fire in him that no mistress could extinguish. Celene lowered her gaze, concealing the turmoil within. She had not wished for this. She had not planned for this. And yet, as her hands brushed against her abdomen, she felt the undeniable truth. These children were hers. Not weapons, not pawns, not burdens. They were her blood, her duty, her unexpected hope. She would endure, not for the Duke, not for the court, but for them. But the more her resolve hardened, the more danger gathered around her. For if she had secured her place in the Duke's house, she had also marked herself as the greatest threat to the woman who had once reigned unchallenged. And Lyria, scorned and desperate, would not allow herself to be replaced without a fight. The news of Celene's pregnancy spread through the palace like wildfire, burning away the mistress's fragile illusion of security. For 3 years, Lyria had ruled the Duke's heart with ease, weaving her charm around him, convincing herself that she was untouchable. But the Duchess, with a single night of reluctant union, had achieved what Lyria never could. 2 heirs, legitimate by blood and law. The throne of Ravenshade's future now rested within Celene's womb. At first, Lyria masked her fury behind a smile that fooled no one. She sent gifts of silk and sweetmeats to Celene's chambers, feigning goodwill, yet her eyes betrayed the storm that brewed within her. In the solitude of her own quarters, her composure shattered. She smashed mirrors, tore fabrics, and screamed into the silence until her voice broke. The Duke's attention, once hers alone, began to shift. Not out of love for his wife, but out of the weight of duty, pride, and lineage. And Lyria could feel him slipping from her grasp. Her first attempts were subtle. She instructed servants loyal to her to slip bitter herbs into the Duchess's tea, cloaked as remedies for nausea. Celene, cautious and already suspicious of the mistress's venomous presence, refused the cups offered, ordering her maid to dispose of them. When days passed and her health remained strong, Lyria's patience snapped. She grew bolder. Once, when Celene walked in the gardens under the winter sun, a carriage suddenly bolted forward, its driver losing control. The Duchess barely managed to step aside, aided by her guards, but whispers of sabotage lingered in the air. Another time, a window shutter fell from an upper floor, crashing onto the path she frequented each morning. The servants whispered of accidents. Celene knew better, but it was not only her body Lyria sought to wound, it was her spirit. Extravagance became the mistress's weapon. She demanded jewels, feasts, gowns imported from distant lands, each coin drawn from the Duke's treasury. The burden fell on Celene, who as Duchess managed the accounts. She confronted Lyria once, presenting the records, her voice steady yet edged with steel. "This waste dishonors the Duke and his house. I will not allow it." Lyria's laughter was like poison. "You think being his wife gives you authority over me? Remember, Duchess, he comes to me, not to you. He loves me. You are nothing more than a cradle for his heirs." When the Duke heard of the quarrel, he stormed into Celene's chamber, fury flashing in his eyes. "How dare you humiliate her before the servants? You will respect Lyria as I have commanded." Celene, with a calmness that startled him, laid the records before him, page after page of ruinous expenses. Her voice did not waver. "If this reaches the ears of the nobility, your name will suffer more than mine. A duke enslaved by a mistress's vanity is not a duke respected in court." For a moment, Theron faltered. His anger cooled, his jaw tightened, and though he did not apologize, he promised to speak with Lyria. Celene saw the conflict in his eyes, yet she knew his blindness to the mistress's flaws remained strong. In less than a week of marriage, Celene had tasted betrayal, humiliation, and the bitterness of survival. But now, carrying 2 lives within her. She felt the stakes sharpen. This was no longer about pride or whispers. This was about protection, and she would not allow Lyria's malice to reach her children. Still, the mistress was not finished, for envy has no limits, and a desperate woman can become more dangerous than an armed army. And soon, Lyria's wrath would take a form no one could ignore. The palace had grown tense, each corridor humming with unspoken hostilities. Servants hurried past with lowered eyes, afraid to be caught in the silent war between the Duchess and the mistress. Celene, now 6 months into her pregnancy, moved carefully through the halls, her hand often resting on her belly, feeling the restless kicks of the lives within her. She carried herself with dignity, but beneath her calm exterior, she knew danger lurked in every shadow. Lyria's temper had grown wilder with each passing day. Her once charming laughter turned to shrill fits of rage, her beauty twisted by envy that no paint or jewel could hide. She could no longer bear the sight of Celene's swelling form, the visible proof of her failure and the Duchess's triumph. And so she decided. If whispers and poisons had not rid her of the rival, she would resort to the oldest, cruelest method of all: violence. It was late afternoon when Celene descended the grand staircase, the golden light of sunset spilling through stained glass windows. She gripped the rail, careful of her balance, her mind already weary from another day of feigned courtesy and hidden threats. That was when she felt it, a sudden brutal shove between her shoulders. Her body lurched forward, her breath caught in her throat, and the world tilted. Instinct and desperation clung to the polished wood of the railing. Her nails scraped as she clung, her feet stumbling down 5 steps before she steadied herself, heart pounding so violently she thought it would tear through her chest. The silence that followed was deafening. Slowly she turned. Lyria stood at the top of the stairs, her face frozen in shock. She had expected screams, blood, perhaps the end of the Duchess and her unborn children. What she had not expected was the tall figure in the shadows behind her. The Duke. Theron had returned earlier than planned from his journey, his steps unnoticed, his presence concealed until that moment. And now he stood motionless, his eyes wide with disbelief as he beheld the scene. The Duchess clinging desperately to the rail, and his mistress, the woman he had defended for years, poised at the top of the stairs with guilt etched into every line of her face. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Celene's voice, steady despite her terror, cut through the silence. "Now you see what I told you." Theron's gaze darted between them. He had dismissed his wife's warnings as paranoia, the fancies of a jealous woman. But here it was, undeniable, before his very eyes. The mistress he had indulged, protected, even elevated, had tried to murder his wife and unborn heirs. Lyria stammered, her hands trembling. It was not what it looked like, my lord. She stumbled, But her words faltered beneath the cold weight of his stare. Celene, breathing heavily, allowed herself no triumph, only relief that she and her children were still alive. The pain of betrayal burned deeper than the fear of the fall. For it was not just Lyria who had endangered her life, it was Theron's blindness that had placed her in peril. The Duke descended the stairs toward his wife, his face pale with shock, his hand reaching out to steady her. For the first time since their union, he touched her not as duty, but as fear. His voice was low, almost broken. "You will not be harmed again. I swear it." Yet Celene's eyes met his with quiet defiance. She had learned too well that words were fragile things, easily shattered by desire, easily forgotten in the arms of another. And though Theron had seen the truth with his own eyes, the question remained: would he truly sever himself from the woman he once adored, or would her poison cling to him even now? The fate of their household, and the survival of their unborn children, depended on his answer. The halls of Ravenshade trembled with the weight of what had transpired. Servants whispered in corners, nobles murmured behind gloved hands, and for the first time in years, Lyria's name was not uttered with admiration, but with horror. The Duke's command was swift and merciless. The mistress was to be confined, stripped of her silks and jewels, and taken to the dungeons until judgment was decided. Lyria did not go quietly. She screamed, cursed, and wept as guards dragged her from the marble staircase where her crime had been laid bare. Her voice echoed through the palace like the cry of a fallen siren, each note laced with venom. "You'll regret this, Theron. You'll regret trading me for her." Her words pierced the air, but the Duke did not flinch. He watched her with an expression torn between disbelief and disgust, the final remnants of affection dying in his eyes. Celene, resting now under the watchful care of the palace physician, received the news with a composure that surprised even herself. She had expected Theron to falter, to forgive the woman as he always had. But the sight of his mistress attempting to kill his heirs had shattered the illusions he had clung to. When he entered her chamber that evening, his face drawn yet resolute, Celene prepared herself for more hollow words. Instead, his voice carried a weight she had never heard before. "I was blind," he said, his eyes fixed on hers. "Blind to who she was, blind to what you endured. I failed you, Celene. I swore to protect you the day we wed, and I broke that vow with every moment I turned away. But no longer. From this day forward, you will have my protection, and she will never touch your life again." Celene studied him, her heart torn between relief and bitterness. For months she had suffered his neglect, his indifference, the humiliation of being treated as less than the woman who wore no crown. And now he came with promises, as though words could heal wounds carved so deep. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to rest in the safety of those vows. Yet doubt clung to her, sharp and unyielding. "Protection," she answered softly, "is not love. Do not mistake one for the other." Her words cut, but Theron did not retreat. Instead, he sank to one knee beside her bed, his hand hovering near hers, though he dared not take it without her permission. "Then let me prove it," he said. "Not with words, not with oaths, but with my actions. You may despise me, Celene, and I deserve it, but I will not leave your side, not again." She turned her gaze away, her breath trembling. The fire of resentment still burned, but beneath it flickered something more fragile, something dangerously close to hope. For though she could not yet forgive him, she could no longer deny what she had seen in his eyes on the staircase: the shock of betrayal, the fear for her life, and the desperate realization of his folly. The mistress was gone, imprisoned and disgraced. But the scars she left behind would not vanish so easily. Now, the true battle began. Not between Celene and Lyria, but between Celene and the man who sought to win back the trust he had so carelessly destroyed. The days following Lyria's imprisonment passed in a strange stillness. The palace, once filled with her shrill laughter and endless demands, seemed almost hollow without her. For the servants, it was a relief. For Theron, it was a reckoning. He found himself walking the corridors with new eyes, remembering each moment he had defended the woman now branded as a traitor, and each time he had dismissed his wife's warnings. Shame clung to him like a second skin. Celene, however, felt no such silence. Though her chambers were quieter, her heart was loud with conflict. She had expected him to replace her, to seek out another mistress, to make her once again the invisible wife. Yet he did not. He remained, hovering like a shadow at her side. He attended the physician's visits, sat with her during long hours of rest, even joined her for supper in private. The courtiers gossiped in wonder. Had the Duke finally turned his heart to his Duchess? But Celene knew better. Attention was not affection. Guilt was not love. She had seen how easily he could be deceived, how willingly he had turned away from her pain. Now he sought to patch the wound he had carved, but the scar remained. One evening, as rain battered the windows, he entered her chamber with a book in hand. "You once told me you favored poetry," he said, setting it gently on her table. "I thought you might like this." She looked at the volume, then at him, her voice steady but cold. "Do you believe gifts erase neglect? That a flower grows where you have salted the earth?" His jaw tightened, yet he did not lash back. "No. I believe a barren field can be tended if one is patient enough to care for it again." She turned away, her heart twisting. His words touched her, but she would not let them take root so easily. "You speak as though I am a field to be cultivated, but I am not soil, Theron. I am a woman who has been treated as less than a mistress in her own home. Do you think I forget that?" Her defiance stung, but he did not retreat. Day by day, he remained. When she tried to push him away, he stayed. When she refused his gestures, he did not relent. The man who once abandoned her to humiliation now bore every rejection in silence, as if each wound was a penance he deserved. Yet beneath her guarded exterior, Celene felt something she had not expected. Exhaustion, not from his presence, but from her own defenses. Every word of bitterness kept her strong, yet it also kept her weary. She longed for peace, for safety, for something more than this endless battle of pride and wounded hearts. And though she swore she would never allow herself to soften, part of her wondered, if he truly meant to prove himself, how far would he go? That question would soon find its answer, in a moment neither of them could foresee, a moment of peril that would demand sacrifice, and with it, reveal the truth of his heart. Spring sunlight bathed the courtyards of Ravenshade, painting the stone walls with warmth, yet Celene felt no ease. Her pregnancy had grown heavy, her steps slower, her strength dimmed. At 9 months, every movement was a trial, and still, she forced herself to walk the gardens, to breathe fresh air rather than suffocate within gilded chambers. Theron often accompanied her, keeping a measured pace at her side, his presence protective, though she tried not to acknowledge it. On that day, the sound of hooves shattered the quiet. A stallion, startled by the clatter of steel from the training yard, tore free from its reins. The animal charged into the garden with wild eyes, its strength unchecked, its path cutting directly toward Celene. She froze, her hands instinctively covering her belly. Panic surged through her, every heartbeat echoing with the fear of loss, not for herself, but for the 2 lives within her. Theron reacted before thought could catch him. He lunged, seizing her by the arms, pulling her aside just as the beast thundered past. The momentum dragged them both down, but not before he shoved her to safety. The horse's flanks slammed into him, throwing him violently onto the stones. The air filled with the sound of guards shouting, hooves retreating, Celene's ragged breaths, and Theron's groan of pain. She turned, trembling, and saw him sprawled across the ground, his leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. Blood darkened his trousers where the hoof had struck. He had placed himself between her and death without hesitation. Theron! The name left her lips not as accusation, not as duty, but as terror. She knelt beside him despite the weight of her body, tears burning her eyes. His face was pale, his jaw clenched against the agony. Yet even then, his gaze sought hers. "You are safe," he whispered, each word heavy with pain. "That is all that matters." Her hand hovered above his chest, uncertain whether to touch him, whether to let herself feel what surged within her. For months she had resisted him, pushed him away, built walls from every betrayal. Yet here he was, broken at her feet, injured not for honor, not for reputation, but for her, for their children. The physician arrived swiftly, ordering men to lift the Duke and carry him to his chambers. Celene followed, her heart a battlefield of pride and gratitude. She sat by his side through the night, listening to his strained breathing as fever threatened to claim him. And for the first time since their vows, she prayed, not for escape, not for vengeance, but for his life. Because though she had sworn to despise him, though she had built her armor from the ashes of his indifference, the truth could no longer be denied. This man, flawed and blinded though he was, had chosen pain over her death. And in that sacrifice, her reluctant heart began to crack. The weeks that followed were marked by a silence unlike any Celene had known before. The Duke, confined to his bed with his injured leg, could no longer walk the halls with the same commanding stride. Instead, he lived in the shadow of his own vulnerability, his pride pierced not by blade or battlefield, but by the simple truth of having risked everything for her. Celene remained at his side more than she cared to admit, watching as his stubborn will fought the pain, as his eyes softened in ways she had never seen before. But time did not wait for wounds to heal. Celene's body carried the weight of destiny, and the 9th month reached its inevitable end. The night her labor began, thunder rolled across the sky, rain lashing against the palace windows as though heaven itself was preparing for battle. Her cries echoed through the chamber, each wave of pain threatening to tear her apart. The midwives rushed about, their hands steady, their voices urgent. Theron, pale and limping, refused to leave her side. The physician urged him to rest, but he would not. He gripped her hand through each contraction, his face taut with helplessness. Sweat dampened her brow, her lips trembled with prayers, her voice breaking as hours bled into long, endless suffering. 20 hours passed before the cries of new life pierced the storm. The first was a boy, strong and wailing, his tiny fists clenched as if already prepared to fight for his place in the world. The second was a girl, her eyes opening briefly to reveal the striking blue of her father's gaze. Celene collapsed back into the pillows, her body trembling with exhaustion, tears slipping down her cheeks as she whispered, "My children." Theron's hand brushed against hers, his own eyes wet with a reverence he did not try to hide. He had seen battlefields drenched in blood, kingdoms rise and fall, yet nothing had ever undone him as completely as the sight of his wife cradling their children. For Celene, the pain was still raw, but as she held the twins against her chest, warmth surged where bitterness had once lived. These children were her reason to endure, her reason to fight, her reason to hope. And as she caught the unguarded look in Theron's eyes, she felt the first flicker of something dangerous and undeniable. Perhaps he had changed. Perhaps the man who once let her suffer in silence was gone, replaced by one who understood, too late, what it meant to cherish. She did not speak the thought aloud, but she felt it linger between them, fragile as new dawn. The storm outside faded, and within the chamber, a different kind of storm settled, one born not of betrayal, but of possibility. The days after the birth of the twins were unlike any Celene had ever known. The palace, once heavy with tension and hostility, filled with the cries of infants and the softer sounds of joy. Servants who had once walked on eggshells now moved with lighter steps, whispering blessings as they passed the nursery. The people of Ravenshade, too, celebrated. Bells rang across villages and towns, and farmers lit fires on their hillsides, for the Duke had heirs, and the Duchy's future was secured. But within the palace walls, another transformation was unfolding, one far less visible than banners or festivals. It was the change in Theron himself. No longer the distant husband who dismissed his wife's words, no longer the man blinded by a mistress's beauty, he was now a father. Each time he limped into the nursery to see the twins, each time he leaned heavily on his cane to soothe their cries, Celene saw a man who was learning humility through love. And yet Celene did not give him her heart so easily. Wounds could not be erased simply by tenderness after years of coldness. When he sat by her side and spoke of his regrets, she listened but answered little. When he vowed again that she would be the only woman in his life, she raised her brow and reminded him that promises had once been empty. Her pride had been broken too many times to be mended overnight, but slowly, almost against her will, she began to see his persistence as something more than guilt. She remembered the moment on the staircase when his eyes had filled with horror, the moment in the garden when his body had shielded hers, the hours he had spent beside her during labor when he might have fled. Actions spoke louder than vows, and his actions, again and again, told her one thing: he had chosen her now. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Celene held her daughter in her arms, while the Duke cradled their son. The infants slept soundly, their breaths soft against their parents' chests. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Theron's voice, low and steady, broke the silence. "I once thought strength was measured by conquest," he said. "By land, by armies, by the fear in men's eyes. But now, strength is this: to keep you safe, to keep them safe, to be worthy of what I almost lost." Celene studied him, her heart tightening. She wanted to remain unmoved, to remind him of all the nights she had cried alone, of all the times she had been treated as less than human in her own home. But as her daughter's tiny fingers curled around hers, she found herself whispering words she had never thought she would. "Do not make me regret forgiving you." The Duke's eyes glistened with a relief he did not hide. He bowed his head, pressing his lips to their son's hair, as though sealing a vow not only to her, but to the family they had created. Celene leaned back, exhaustion mingling with peace. Perhaps it had been divine will that her plans to escape had failed. Perhaps it had been fate that bound her to this man, forcing her to walk through fire before she could glimpse the light. Whatever it was, she knew one truth with certainty. The storm that had nearly destroyed her had given birth to more than sorrow. It had given her children, it had given her strength, and perhaps, just perhaps, it had given her love. And in the quiet calm of that chamber, as the twins slept between them, Celene allowed herself to believe that her story was no longer one of survival alone. It was the beginning of something new, born from ruin, yet capable of enduring. The tale of the Duchess, who was once humiliated, betrayed, and nearly destroyed, had become the tale of a woman who endured, who outlasted envy and cruelty, and who found, against all odds, that even in a marriage forged in ambition, love could rise from the ashes.